I actually want to start by talking about something I don't have in my slides. And that's OSCON. So 3 years ago, I was at OSCON, and I was interviewing for a job at AWS. And one of the things they said when I was interviewing was, we kind of don't really have anybody trying to tell the story, an outbound story about open source. Would you like to pick that up as something to be doing? And I'm going, well, I got to OSCON and talked to some people about that, and I had a few chats with some people. And I was talking to Zahida Borat, and she said she was looking for something to do too. So, well, maybe we'll both join AWS and see if we can figure out how to get this going. So that was 3 years ago. 2 years ago, really, I got me and Zahida both joined. I think we had Arun had just joined, so that we just had a very basic team, and we cobbled together the first appearance of AWS at OSCON, at this high level sponsorship, and that was really, really hard. We were scrambling at the last minute to get this stuff happening. We had a booth that was just couches, right? There was no organization. We just made it happen. But okay, we turned up, right? Last year, okay, I had Shirley Bales, who some of you know ran OSCON back in the day, and so okay, we have a professional person. So last year was awesome, right? We actually know what we're doing. And this year we went one step further. And on Tuesday, we had a whole day of AWS open source. We just organized a day. We were out in the rooms around the back there, and we did a whole day back to back. And the day after, people were saying, well, I didn't know you were doing that day. And there was a bunch of good talks there. We had Adam, we had Vicky, some panel sessions and all kinds of things. So I just want to let you know, we'll be back next year, same as we were this year. Our booth will be in the same place, and we'll be running the open source day again. So when you come back next year, look at coming on Tuesday and hanging out with the AWS. We'll have more projects to talk about. So in that sense, I've used OSCON as a force multiplier to actually take just a few of us and figure out how to leverage that to get AWS to do more in open source and to get the message out about what we're doing in open source. But what I wanted to talk about the rest of this session is, what is this market for open source, and how can you leverage cloud in order to do a better job with that? So here's the original market. Right? There were data centers, there were CIOs, they filled stuff with enterprise software, and they were pretty unhappy with the rate of innovation and the cost of this. So they got a whole load of open source software, and they put it in their data center, and that made them happy. Right? So this was, for a long time, the market for open source was, I can sell it in the data center, and I'm selling against an enterprise solution that's ridiculously expensive, and my open source thing is reasonably priced, and it's innovating faster, so that made everyone happy. So we did that for a while. But how did this evolve over time? First thing was, around about 2010, when I started doing cloud with AWS when I was at Netflix, we were using cloud, unicorns, that's what we call the Netflix type things. The early adopters and startups were using cloud. But really, the open source market was still pretty much everything in the data center, but it was starting to catch on. If you move on about 5 years to 2015, AWS now has quite a decent set of open source services, but they're really only being used by early adopter enterprise and the web-scaled startups, the Netflix, Airbnb, those kinds of people. And the mainstream enterprise was still, now, anytime they did a new project in the data center, it was very much likely to be based on open source software. So there's a nice, big, fat market, lots of opportunity here. People are doing well, and the enterprise stuff is fading away. So this becomes the new normal from about 2015. Well, what's happening now is the CIOs are going, I'm fed up with data centers. I want to move to cloud. Can you run this for me? Right? And this is where the problems really start. And we have to look at, where does an open source business come from? So if we think about, the customers are now saying, I want a cloud-based version of this, but let's go through the process of creating an open source company and what that looks like. So we start a new project, there's a developer community, they built some software, they're putting in a data center, they put a copy on GitHub and say, hey, we've open sourced this. A bunch of other people say, that looks cool, lots of people start using it. And then what happens is, you form a little business to do support for that. So this is one of the standard ways that you get going with an open source project. That business now has some revenue, they fix things, they add to the code, but the developer community is still primarily taking that code and installing it, and they are doing a lot of contributions to it. So that business is now using the developer community as a force multiplier for engineering. It means they don't have to invest as much in engineering as if they were doing 100% of this themselves, because the community is actually doing some of their engineering from them. And then that community is now learned how to use that product and how it works. When you want to hire somebody, you go to the community and you have all of these pre-trained people you can hire. So it's a very efficient way of hiring people and using external engineering. So this is a nice little feedback loop. This works well. And then you take the enthusiasm of those people and use that to create market awareness, and you invest in that market. So now you've got your marketing is being effectively, you're using open source to magnify your effect in the marketing side, right? That the enthusiasm is helping, and you're contributing, and it's all got this nice big feedback loop. So this is what a typical open source business looks like. There's lots of examples of it. Back to 2015, this was what people were working on, but you're primarily targeting the data center to do this. All right. So then what happens when the cloud comes along? What are you going to do? How can you use cloud to be a multiplier? So customers start running the free open source software that they can get from GitHub on the cloud. And they do that themselves for a while, and that's fine, but then it's kind of annoying. So then they say, can you just help us run this? So then the cloud providers start doing easy-to-use versions of the free software that was on GitHub, right? So this is naturally evolving. And what you've got in the data center is more of an enterprise product. So this causes an issue, because if you're an open source business competing with an enterprise product, that's really expensive. You can price against the enterprise product. But if you're looking at competing against the free software with a slight markup because somebody's running it for you, you've actually got two different pricing models. And this is one of the other problems that people are trying to figure out. Because if you go with the enterprise product, you look too expensive compared to the other one, the cloud-based version. And if you move to the cloud-based version, then you're sort of leaving money on the table on the enterprise side, and it's hard to do two pricing models for basically the same product. So this is one of the sources of conflict that emerges. And effectively you have to disrupt yourself by moving to the cloud and figuring out what is the right pricing for a service in the cloud. So then you have to also do something, which is learn to run and operate a cloud service. And a lot of open source-based businesses, they were shipping tar files or whatever to the enterprise to install, whatever RPMs or something. And they weren't used to running it as a service. So now you have to learn to run that. And that takes a little while, but some people have done that, others haven't. But obviously the cloud providers all know how to run a service, so that's obviously easy for us. But then you can use the cloud providers for sales reach, because they have marketplaces. You put your code in the marketplace. That reaches customers that didn't know about you. You look in the marketplace and you want to buy a log analysis thing, and there's 10 different vendors in there, and the enterprise looks at that and says, well, some good cheap ones here. I haven't heard of these, but you get a lot of visibility. So this is another place where we're seeing a lot of activity. But then you start to worry about competing with the cloud. And we've got this as Adam was saying, use a restrictive license to prevent the cloud from competing. So what happens here? You've got this open source business, open source software business is now moving to an available source software business. And you've got the open source and these proprietary services sort of competing in the cloud. And what you're doing by moving to an available source business is you're actually cutting off the developer community. Because who wants to contribute some code to some proprietary software that I can't then use in the future? Right? It doesn't make sense that you're cutting off that. And then they're a bit less enthusiastic about them, so you're cutting off some of the marketing. So this is what Adam was pointing out. You're actually cutting off your opportunities to actually sell. So this license change reduces contributors and developer enthusiasm. You're actually cutting off those multipliers. And if you've ever got some open source software and you want to relicense it, recommendation is always go to a less restrictive license. We've actually relicensed a bunch of software at AWS, taking it from some weird licensing to standard, less restrictive licenses. If you take some software that is open source and move that software to a more restrictive license, that kind of feels bad. And I call that maneuver the Oz backwards strategy. So, because it's like, it's not the point of open source. Is you're enabling everybody to contribute and the enthusiasm, the contributions. And if you're pulling in the opposite direction, you're cutting off that whole supply, which was the reason for doing open source in the first place. All right. So, and what AWS does is, we have a business to run, we have stuff to do, we have customers that want things, and the customers say, I like this open source software that you're running that's nice and cheap and that's based on the open source version, but it needs security. Everyone needs security, and there isn't any security because that's an enterprise feature. And I think if anyone out there building open source things, security should not be a premium feature. It has to be baked in. It's a baseline feature in today's market. So, we started releasing things like Corretto to give you an open source version and a free version of Java. We released open source extensions to Redis, and we did that again for Elasticsearch as well. So some better strategies for how to do this. MongoDB have done a much better job here. They were always, as Adam pointed out, focused on using open source as a marketing vehicle rather than a contribution vehicle. They really had very few contributions, and that was not what they were trying to do. But they learned to build and operate a cloud service called MongoDB Atlas. Did a good job with it and priced it to be a cloud service. They figured out that piece of the model. They then used the cloud marketplace to reach a lot of customers within AWS. And how's this going? Well, over the last 6 quarters, they've gone from 11% of their revenue in Cloud Atlas to 35%. So they have basically now, a lot of their income is coming from this service. And AWS and Microsoft, Azure, have both built clone versions of MongoDB, which are not impacting that growth. It's a big market. We're endorsing that market, and we're getting more and more. So we're basically doing this thing where the market just gets bigger and bigger as more people come in. So you don't have to own all of the market, but if other people come in, it's a bigger market. And then this year, at reInvent, our big conference, MongoDB is a top-level sponsor. It's like Intel, VMware, and MongoDB, the highest level you can get, right? They are leveraging all of the AWS marketing around reInvent to be absolutely in your face with all the customers as a key piece of software. So that's a clever move, and that they're leveraging everything that AWS does. So they're using cloud as a force multiplier very effectively. And if you're competing with MongoDB, you're going like, well, what about us? And the customer says, well, I don't see anyone running you as a service, so you're probably just going to go away eventually, right? What's the long-term support model for something that no one seems to care about, right? So it's an endorsement effectively of that brand. Just quickly go through Chef. We did a licensed version. It was a revenue sharing deal. And what Chef does is use AWS for long tail reach to really small customers that just wanted something at a very small cost level, deal level, where it's not worth putting a sales rep on it, right? And then they can focus on the large customers and use this as a customer onboarding mechanism. So that's another good way of doing it. Weaveworks has done some good work with us. They've contributed to our projects. They've built on top of AWS projects, and they've positioned themselves as a premium partner, one of the best partners of AWS in the Kubernetes space. So that's another way you can leverage what we're doing. All right, so just to wrap up, this is the functionality. This is the evolution. You're always going to build some custom thing. You're then going to buy it as an enterprise off-the-shelf software. Then there'll be an open source version, and then it'll run as a service. In the first thing, you're basically force multipliers. You're saving money. You're standardizing a vendor solution. The second one, that costs a lot, so you want to basically use an open source version because that lets you go faster with the community. And to run it as a service just keeps it simpler, and that improves your scalability and availability. So these are the different things that drive the market to the right. So just to summarize, these are the things. AWS, what we give you is speed of deployment, scalability, and availability. It just makes it easier to run anything. the marketplace, we have machine image marketplace, we have a container marketplace, and we have a service marketplace. You can provide a SaaS service with a private endpoint that is not visible to the internet. So the services appear the same way that AWS's own services appear. Right? So the complete security model is the same as an AWS service, but you can have a custom third-party service plugged into a customer environment in a completely secure way. So that's a really key extension. We have a really long commitment to our services. We've really never shut anything down. So if we have a service based on an open source product, that open source project is going to live for a long time. That's a bet we're making, and we're very incented to make sure that project is successful for a long time. It doesn't make sense for us to kill a project that we've got a service based on. We help the brand. We're increasing our contributions to the code, and this has been ramping up over the years. We're getting better at filing bug fixes and extensions and getting more people on it. And then there's very efficient long-tail sales reach using the AWS Marketplace. And finally, we've got a bunch of projects we're releasing. You can leverage them. You can have supported Java for free. There's Amplify for building UIs, and Firecracker if you want to play around with virtual machines. So fundamentally, this is it. This is my last slide. So the new business model for open source is to figure out how to satisfy this need, because this is what the CIOs are spending money on, and that's where the market is. It's whatever the CIOs want to do right now. That's the bulk of the market, and they want you to run it for them. So think about that. Figure out how to run a service. Figure out how to leverage AWS to support that. So thank you.